So I'm speaking to Tessa Jones, another Tessa, Chief Data Scientist at Calligo that specializes in cloud and data. And there's so much hype about ChatGPT right now. Very difficult to say that always, especially in the writing and content industry, which is, of course, my industry as founder of The Power of Words. And a lot of angles have been covered. Of course, we've all been inundated with news about ChatGPT in the last month alone. But I've yet to hear actually from a data scientist who opts for human written content. And so I thought this was a really interesting angle to explore. So Tessa, thank you so much for jumping on board with this.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm excited to talk about it. It's a really interesting topic for sure.
Well, it's right up your alley. But look, ChatGPT is so smart. It is so smart. And I think that's why everyone's talking about it. It's disrupting my industry, as I've said, writing for businesses. It's disrupting quite a few different industries at the same time, legal, translators, things like that. But you're a leading data scientist who knows a lot about AI. So let's go in with a biggie to begin with. Would you choose or use rather ChatGPT to write things for you that the public would see? And if so, why? And if not, why not?
Yeah, I wouldn't use it for that purpose. I view Chat GPT as more of a toy than a tool at this point. Um, and just to reference what you're saying, smart, not smart. I would actually say, yes, it's smart in the sense that it's consumed all this information and it knows how to regurgitate it. It knows how to sort of have a conversation around existing facts. But I would say that it doesn't quote unquote understand it relative to context. So when a human learns something, typically they can understand it within the context of something and generate ideas from that place. And ChatGPT just doesn't do that. It's brilliant at a lot of things, but it just doesn't do that because that's a different level of intelligence. And for me, as you know, because we work together, a lot of what I write is about different ideas and concepts that I'm having that I want to present. And that doesn't necessarily exist. And so I don't want to engage with a tool and it's not actually going to learn from me, really, because it doesn't learn on the fly, right? It's already done all of its learning. It's not going to learn more as I'm speaking to it, which is really how I work. Like when we work together, I'm communicating some sort of concept or idea, and then the cool thing about how we interact is that you come up with an interesting creative way to communicate it. And if I can't have that kind of dialogue with it, then it's not very meaningful for me. So I yeah, and not only that, but I think that I think there's a human component that just isn't there. Like I like being in dialogue. And not that ChatGPT can't. I've been very impressed with the other day I put a version of Buddha up like, ChatGPT generated Buddha system up against like a Catholic person. And I just let them talk to each other. And it was really actually cool and interesting. And thought it was very impressive. But that's very different than what I actually need from a writer. So
And it's interesting what you say about how it's done its learning. I think ChatGPT finished learning in September 2021. But there's also, we're talking about ChatGPT, but of course there's tons of AI, writing tools now flooding the market. But I guess, if it's done its learning, it will update and it will get better and it will, and I think that's why it's the speed and veracity even in which it's sort of updating and learning and evolving is incredible. So the speed is one thing, and it's okay. Like the writing isn't terrible. That's what I was quite surprised about. It's not amazing, but it's really decent. But let's get techie for a minute because I think we're all been brought up to speed, I think, over the last couple of months in a way that we hadn't before about kind of this sort of thing. But tell us, how on earth, let's get techie, how does it even work? I mean, it's extraordinary. How does it work in non-data science speak?
sure, yeah. So NLP in general, natural language processing in general, has a series of things that it does just as part of a foundational way of working. So basically, computers only speak in numbers and vectors, basically. They don't speak Spanish versus English and so on and so forth. So the first thing that needs to happen is you need to take in the language and convert it to something that the computer can actually understand. So basically what it does is it splits the whole content into words or tokens, and then it standardizes those words. And we as a language have typical stop words, we call them, which are basically like words that we don't really care about. We want to pull them out. And then we want to reduce them to their base word so that we know what it means, even though, learned versus learning is basically just learn. It's just kind of got a tense going on. And then they're reduced to that form, and then they're tagged for part of speech. So all that is basically just the first baby step in NLP to just kind of be able to consume text in a way that computers can see and understand them in a way that they can consume it and sort of score it, so to speak. So chat GPT, so GPT actually stands for generated pre-trained transformer. So generated basically just means that it can generate language. So it's not just consuming information, right? So there's a lot of NLP system out there that just consume information and say, these are the basic topics of the information I'm getting, or here's the general sentiment. And it kind of comes out with some sort of analysis of that text, but not necessarily generating a conversational piece in response. So the first piece is basically just that it can actually generate language in response to. And then there's the pre-trained, which basically just means that it's pre-trained. So it took gobs of data. I think ChatGPT took something like 570 gigabytes of data, which included lots of like human conversation data, right? So it's basically just pre-trained. And then the really fundamental change that made ChatGPT kind of go to another level is this idea of a transformer. So basically, you have an encoder and a decoder. So basically, the encoder kind of goes through all of those 7 steps, feeds something to the decoder, and then the decoder calculates kind of how much attention to give each of these sections of speech. And it starts to build out, it goes through sort of a reinforcement learning system that maximizes the reward for the scores of responses that happen within that decoder system. So basically, it's learning how to be better, which is pretty cool. And it's learning how to be better through like a back and forth between the encoder and the decoder. So that's part of why it's so powerful of a system. So
Yeah, and that might be, I mean, I don't know if you know the answer to this, but when I was playing around with Copy AI, I couldn't actually get onto ChatGPT because it's a deluge of people using it. But Copy.ai, what I found really interesting, some people are saying, no, but the language isn't nuanced. They don't really understand things like tone of voice. But actually, you can put in, I want it to be persuasive. I want it to be conversational. I want it to be emotional. I want it to be funny. I mean, I don't even know how to get my head around that. I mean, that's extraordinary.
yeah, and it's interesting how, I mean, it's kind of like humans to me if I think about it, where like if I'm on like a chat system of some sort, like Slack or Teams or even text messaging, I don't always pick up on certain things like sarcasm, or are they being funny, or were they being serious, because it's not actually easy just through text to know that. But there is an idea of what something funny should be, or what something persuasive should be. And I think that Chat GPT is smart enough to know what that is in terms of what it looks like in terms of the characteristics of the speech or words that are coming out. And so I think they can classify it, but I wouldn't necessarily say that if you're trying to be funny with it, you're trying to chat with it and try to I don't know if it would pick up on that nuance live,
Mm.
right? But it can categorize it, because it has examples to work from.
One of the key criticisms is, of course, credibility. And is that because ChatGPT is basically mining information from wherever it can get it from? And that information isn't necessarily from a reliable source. So, like, we can all put our own bios on Wikipedia if we want. They may not be true. And does it
Yeah.
mean it's raiding information out there that isn't necessarily correct? Or, of course, you're going to have loads of different, given that amount of data, you're going to have tons of conflicting evidence. So it's
Yeah.
going for, like, is it just going for the one that's most talked about and assuming it's, so I think that's like one of the most arguments against it, is the credibility, trustworthy nature of this content. And it doesn't source either, which
Yeah.
people say might change. That will probably be one of the key things that they try and change in the future if it's going to have success. But
Yeah.
am I right in thinking, like, how does it know what information it should
Yeah. And and
it's just
that's
mind
interesting,
blowing.
and it's tough because you're right. It is like it's kind of a mirror of what we have in the world, right? Available. And that isn't like necessarily like one thing. That's millions and millions of things. And so I think that is part of it, what you're saying, just that it's like replicating the data that it has in it, which you would never say is just all true or all real or reliable. Um, the other part of it is that going back to this idea that chat gpt, and the vernacular here gets really messy in terms of how we talk about it, but I wouldn't say that it's, obviously it's a wonderful powerful AI system, but I wouldn't call it intelligent in the sense that if I start a conversation with it and I ask it, a specific question that is maybe misleading, or I know is I'm prompting it for a false answer, it's going to very, very well basically give me an argument for that wrong answer confidently. And it just does it. It doesn't say, oh, maybe you should like think about whether that's even the right assumption, or in it doesn't necessarily have the capability to put it into a full context of everything. It's basically just doing exactly what you're asking it to do. And I read something that said that I really liked, is that it's kind of like, and not to put high schoolers down. I have a high schooler. They're great and wonderful at many things, but that it's basically like a high schooler writing reports, whatever the teacher was prompting it. And that's kind of what it reminds me of,
Mm.
where it's like, it's basically going to regurgitate what it has seen or learned in sort of a rudimentary way, probably. But it's going to do it with an immense amount of confidence,
Yeah,
which is where it gets scary. Yeah.
also like a teenager. I think I think actually that's an area that's really going to be stuffed. The kind of high school reports and assignments and
Oh
essays.
yeah.
I mean, yeah, that's an absolute minefield. I don't even know how they're going to get their heads around that. I mean, this feels like, from my sort of limited knowledge of just playing around and obviously being in the writing industry, this feels like almost like the beginning of AI's writing career. So probably what we're seeing, I wrote an article in 2018 about the rise of robo-journalism, and I kind of ended it saying, not worried yet. And here we are in 2023, and the change in terms of what it's able to do is just extraordinary. And I totally get that you say it's not as intelligent. You are more exposed to dealing with bots than the average Joe. So that's really interesting to see that. I think people who aren't used to it are probably more kind of in awe of it, but understanding of its limitations.
Right.
But yeah, do you think it's right to say this is just the kind of tip of the iceberg? Is this just the very beginning of more to come? Or do
I
you
mean,
think
yeah,
limitations will, this is conjecture, of course. I mean,
of course. So here, and this is where we get into kind of a broader debate about this topic in general amongst even scientists, where it's like, will we ever achieve general AI? General AI meaning that we're going to be able to build systems that can basically genuinely replicate the human brain and its experience and how it functions and operates and understands the world around it and engages with it. I tend to follow in the camp of that. I just don't think that we'll get there fully. I think that they're going to be able to make it seem like they're there very well. Like even with Chat GPT, if you're chatting with it, it's like, I know there was, unfortunately, a healthcare app that used it, and people felt really good. It made people feel really good, really cared for, really listened to, and they thought they were speaking to a human. So of course I think that they can be like sort of replicated in that sense. But I just think that the human experience has too much nuance. We are not just a bag of neurons consuming information. We're so much more than that. We are, we're chemistry. We're a body. We have sensate experiences that I think contribute to intelligence differently. And now I know I've gone into a whole different thing, but what you're describing to me, I think we're going to hit a point where there's that limitation. And it kind of goes back to what I said originally, where part of why I like working with you is because I can have a dialogue with you where I feel like you're learning from me and I'm learning from you. And I think we could reach that point actually where because right now the pre-trained thing is part of the issue, right? Like I could probably create my own neuro NLP model that actually was being trained by me, right? Or if I was someone who had more content out in the internet and wasn't trying to generate new content, but rather just trying to regenerate some of these same old content, maybe it would be a different experience. But I still think that we have that limitation of the ability for them to contextualize information and then present it. I think that will be an issue for a long time.
And I think, the inability to look forward, which is, quite important, isn't it? To sort of not predict, but, certainly give insight on what might be coming up ahead is something that, I mean, I'm not sure it could ever do that. And it's interesting because
Yeah.
you touched on this a lot and you've been mentioning this a bit, that kind of nuance, that emotional nuance, that kind of EQ as well as IQ. And I know this came up in a podcast that you did a while ago. And there are some people who believe, the whole sentience debate, that AI is capable of EQ, emotional intelligence, as well as IQ. I mean, it's fascinating, and it's probably too big a topic for today, but there are some people out there, on there.
Oh, there are. Yeah. And I would argue, and it's just briefly, I think that it's such an interesting debate because if I'm really honest, I think there's a lot of humans out there that are so dissociated and cut off from their own feelings that they do largely act like how I would expect a robot to act, which really blurs the lines, right? Because then it's like, well, what is that? But I think that for me, the robot doesn't have the option to actually feel the emotions. They can understand it and replicate it and, you know, act it out, but I don't think that they can actually feel it because that's a bodily experience. And so that's my opinion.
Definitely. And a few weeks ago, and actually these stories are coming out all the time. Basically, people are putting ChatGPT and the like through various different tests to see how they fare.
Yeah.
One which was fairly crazy was passing an MBA exam. You think by the time you get to MBA level, it's different to
Yeah.
high school assignments. I think a professor in Pennsylvania put it through the MBA exam and it passed. I mean, that's pretty mind-blowing as well, isn't it? I mean,
Yeah.
presumably that's indicative of the fact that MBA exams are fairly backward-looking in terms of what they're asking in terms of, learning things from the past. I mean, how is that even possible?
Sure. Well, I don't know a lot about the MBA exam because I've never taken it. But what I imagine is that there's a lot of material out there that talks about taking MBA exams and the strategies of taking MBA exams and the content or information that informs the answers to those. And I don't know, I assume some of that was in the training data. And, again, to me, that it is massively impressive and so cool, I think. I mean, I don't want to downplay that because I think it's just really amazing. But again, it's kind of like replicating information. Do you remember that that old movie from the 80s? What was it called? Circuit 5 or Johnny 5, the
Oh,
robot
with the
Johnny
little,
5.
yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Johnny Five is alive.
Johnny 5 is alive, right? And when he first is like comes out of the facility, he's just like reading books, need more data, and he's just like, consuming it all. And then he knows all this stuff that he can like sort of regurgitate. And to me, that's kind of like the MBA, because when you think about a person who goes through an MBA program or any school program, that's most of what they're doing. They're consuming a ton of information and then demonstrating that they've learned that information. And so it does. I mean, it is
But it doesn't
massively
surprise you.
impressive, but it doesn't surprise me,
Yeah.
right? Yeah, that it was able to do that. Yeah.
There is a really humorous quote by a Spectator journalist, Sean Thomas. He says, "I have to say we are screwed, by which mean we, the writers, we're screwed. Writing is over. That's it. It's time to pack away your quill, your biro, your shiny iPad. The computers will soon be here to do it better." Linking back to the, my very first question to you, what's your take on that?
Um,
I mean, for me,
so
in the industry, I think it's not about ignoring it and pretending it's not I don't see it as a threat. People are using the word threat. I think that's very sort of a bit hyperbolic. I think, it's definitely a disruptor, but it's something that is there's going to be a hybrid. I mean, I've been using AI actually for a long time. Things like, when I go away from this interview, I might use Happy Scribe, for example, to come up with the what's the word? The wording. What's transcribing? That's it, for transcribing,
okay.
like that. So actually, I see a sort of hybrid model evolving, whereby there'll be an efficiency piece, and it might speed up
I mean,
ideas or a bit of info maybe, but you'd have to check it every step of
yeah.
the way. Is that your take?
Totally. I mean, that's my opinion, and I'm not a writer, but I read a fair bit. And of course, I read things related to science and all that stuff. And if we're writing about regurgitating information, then of course ChatGPT would be great for that. You have to have someone who's actually like formulating the output. But I think that like writing to me is about so much more than just regurgitating something. Like it's like when I read something, I want it to have some sort of interesting human element to it. And that's like so vague and maybe isn't a very good answer. But I kind of view it more as a helper as well, I guess. All that to say, where I think that even if I were to use it, which I'm not a writer, but like if like ghostwriting was to go away and I were to use it, I can imagine that I'm going to be really frustrated personally, and I'm going to have to come up with phrases for it to use as a launching point. And I just don't want to do that. Like I've already decided I'm not a writer. But that process is a writing process, the creative process of, okay, I need a section that kind of talks about this in this way. Maybe you can say it makes it funny, and then you do another one. And but then when it outputs, you have to craft it or recraft your phrase, and that is, to me, is a writing process. It's not like it becomes an art form to know how to even use the tool, I think.